Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.
Coming up in our push to train future workers to compete in a global economy, are we short-shrifting the study of our own selves? A conversation with the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities about culture, civility, and curiosity. Stay tuned, Dialogue is next. Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Marcia Franklin. A welcome as well to those of you listening on public radio and the World Wide Web. In lean economic times such as now, people often want to study only subjects they think will help them get a job, including technology, science, and math. Courses in the humanities, fields of learning like history, literature, language, and philosophy, have increasingly been viewed as luxuries, subjects to take only if you have the time or need to meet a requirement. There are those, though, who believe that steeping yourself in the humanities can not only prepare you for the workplace, but is even more critical in times like these. My guest today shares that view. Jim Leach is the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. The NEH, as it's known, is an independent federal agency created in 1965. It operates on a budget of more than $160 million, with most of that money distributed in the form of grants to state humanities councils, cultural institutions like museums and libraries, universities, scholars, and yes, even television stations like this one. President Obama appointed Mr. Leach to his post in July 2009, and the U.S. Senate confirmed him in August of that year. In his former work life, Chairman Leach served 15 terms as a Republican congressman from Iowa. During his 30-year tenure on Capitol Hill, among other duties, he chaired the Banking and Financial Services Committee, was a senior member of the House Committee on International Relations, and a founder and co-chair of the Congressional Humanities Caucus. Prior to his appointment to the NEH, Mr. Leach was a visiting professor at Princeton University and the interim director of the Institute of Politics at the J.F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard. And I should add, he's also been inducted into 2 Wrestling Halls of Fame, so clearly he can hold his own. Welcome.
Well, good to be with you, Marcia.
Thanks for being here. And one note before we begin, as this is a taped program, there will be no phone calls. So, one of the big things that you have started as NEH chairman, and one of your priorities, and it's evidenced by the pin you're wearing, which says civility on it, is you are on a 50-state civility tour, as you call it. It might seem a little different for a former politician and a former wrestler to be talking about civility, but in fact, your careers in your career in politics and your experience in sports really guide you in this desire to have this civility tour. Talk a little bit about why you've made this such a priority.
Well, we've had problems in American history, after all. In the 19th century, a vice president actually shot dead the Secretary of the Treasury. But we've seen something the last 30 years that is quite significant. We've seen an erosion of respect between the parties, between individuals in the parties, and we're seeing a kind of a polarization in the American countryside that I think warrants attention, because sometimes the temper and the integrity of debate and how we achieve things is often more important than what we're talking about. Now, you mentioned for a second sports, and I want to be very precise on this. There are a lot of analogies between sports and politics, but I used to think they were very close, but they're getting more distant, and they're getting more distant because sports has a higher ethic than politics. In sports, coaches teach kids to respect the opponent. They teach kids to play by the rules. If a rule is broken, a clip in a football game, an offside, a ball or a strike in baseball, a referee plays a rule. Flags are dropped, whistles are blown, signals are given, people are advantaged or disadvantaged, penalties are made. And in politics, there just isn't that. And somehow we're not only not seeing the public giving the benefit of the doubt to people who play the right way, but we're seeing advantages given to people who don't. And I think the public is going to have to think this through.
Well, as you've mentioned, there's been an uncivil component of politics for decades and decades and decades. What do you think is different now that has made you want to make this a priority in your tenure?
Well, first, I do want to emphasize you need vigorous debate. That's just absolutely essential. It's the only way you avoid dogmatism or even block tyranny. But what's different is the all-consuming nature of the media, and then the new sources of social media that present perspectives. Some are deeper and wiser. For example, some of the academic media today is absolutely sensational, what you can pick up on the internet on in-depth understanding of issues.
Sensational meaning in a good way.
In a good way. Some is sensationalist in a not so good way, rumor mongering, quasi-hate speech, etc. And there is a tendency now in the public for people not to challenge their own views. There's a tendency, if one leans to the right, only to watch rightist things. If one leans to the left, only to watch lefter types of things. And I think we're going to have to challenge America to saying, if you're liberal, watch a conservative show or see a conservative blog. Vice versa if one's a conservative.
So what's the result of this? What do you see as the detriment to this uncivil tone?
Well, the detriment is that a country is a little bit like a team. You can take a team of people that are not great athletes, but if they work together, they can achieve a lot. You can take a team of great athletes, and if they don't work together, things don't work well. And I think we're on the cusp as a society of so polarizing that we're not going to be able to come together as an American family. And I think we've got to think of ourselves as a family rather than to think of ourselves as warring against each other.
Well, you have pointed out in some of your writings that you feel that the very way that our political system is set up lends itself to kind of this polarization, because so much is decided at the primary level, and that's where factions who are kind of more on the fringes vote.
Well, the two great weaknesses in the American political system today, in my judgment, are one, that there's too much money in it, and two, that there's a tendency of the parties in the primary process to nominate people on the right side of the Republican Party and the left side of the Democratic Party. And the great American moderate is almost unrepresented today at the national legislature. In fact, there's an incentive now for very conservative members not to cooperate with very liberal members, and for very liberal members not to cooperate with very conservative members. And so how do you reach a consensus that's anything like that can be acceptable to the public?
We've seen that in our neighboring state with Mr. Bennett of Utah.
Right, it's a real tragedy. Bob Bennett is one of the great gentlemen conservatives in the United States Congress. And he was booed at his own state caucus.
Because he had worked across party lines, and in part.
That's right. And I believe you can keep convictions and work with people with whom you disagree. I mean, the classic example on the Democratic side was Ted Kennedy, who was as liberal as any Democrat in the Senate, but he worked with Republicans. Bob Bennett was as conservative a Republican senator as there is, but he worked with Democrats. That's fine. That should be rewarded, not punished.
Now, it's been pointed out many times, of course, that you're a Republican and you were nominated by a Democratic president, and you endorsed him at the Democratic convention. What made you want to do that?
Well, basically, I consider myself someone that's very concerned on conservative kinds of economic issues, but I was absolutely convinced we needed to change our foreign policy and that we needed a new view with the world, and that the Democratic Party had presented a very unique candidate who had a unique capacity to reach out to people around the world with whom we are in great difficulty. And if we're going to have a century in which this country is going to be able to deal with other countries on a credible basis, we're going to have a change from a polarized international foreign policy. And that is the reason that I endorsed Senator Obama at the time.
And very briefly, another thing that you've spoken out on in these civility tours, and did so in Idaho, is a recent Supreme Court ruling that has to do with corporations being able to donate directly to campaigns, to politicians, and basically equating corporations with individuals and free speech with money.
Well, I think one of the myths is that civility is all about polite language. Actually, civility is about being respectful to other people's views. The difficulty of the recent Supreme Court ruling, which was the allowance of corporations to give money to candidates is that it became the issue of money talking, and the talking could be quite polite. For example, if you're a legislator and I'm a lobbyist and I say to you, Madam Legislator, we helped you in your last campaign. We want to really help you in the next one even more, but we have this vote tomorrow. We sure hope you can be with us. And by the way, how's your spouse? That's very polite, but it's a very uncivil concept. I mean, it implies a financial quid pro quo, which is not the way the American system would work. And frankly, if there is anything that I think the Tea Party activist and the Naderite liberal ought to come to agreement on, it is somehow to get the big money out of politics. Because if you don't, the vested interests are the all-powerful that weaken the individual. And one of the foundations of some of the dissent in this country is a sense that decision-making is being made outside the control of the individual. And that, I think, frankly, is a frustration that has a great deal of validity.
What do you hope will come out of your conversations that you're having across the country on this issue of civility?
Well, I don't know. My only sense is, because I think voices of one kind or another are voices that often get lost, is that it's important to give voice to the concerns and then let people make up their own minds of what matters and doesn't matter. And so, for example, I talk about elections, and I suggest that sounds kind of odd that it's less important which party has a majority than it is whether the people are willing to work with the other side. And I think that's the bigger issue in America, and it's something we all have to think about.
Now, you spoke to a group of people who love the humanities today. In Idaho, I don't know who you've been speaking to in other states, but are you preaching kind of already to the converted on this issue? I mean, I'm thinking maybe this conversation could be had in places where people have been, say, locked up for being uncivil.
Yeah.
And rather...
Well, there's an aspect that all of us have a tendency to be wanting to be heard by people who accept a perspective before. But I'm invited to a lot of places that surprise. We had several universities in California that have had an outbreak of, for example, a swastika painting on dorm rooms. And I've been asked to address students about this and to try to bring a sense of history to the meaning of a swastika, which is really a symbol of as great intense hate as any symbol that's ever been developed, possibly in history, and what it means to people, in this case, of the Jewish faith, and who might have had ancestors or that were killed in the Holocaust. And it might only be a few students in a few rooms, but what does a student think when they have their dorm room painted with a swastika? What kind of loving environment is that of a community? So
you're reaching out to students as
well?
So
we're reaching out to students, absolutely. And there are lots of emanations of some of the angst in our society that we have to think through.
Now, a few people have actually criticized you for doing this in your role as NEH chairman. There's somebody from the National Association of Scholars, Peter Wood. You've probably read his articles. And among other things, he says that, you know, your tone in these conversations departs from an NEH tradition, which has generally celebrated American cultural achievement rather than castigating Americans for their failings. And he goes on to say that your desire to promote your brand of civility, in which the culture war is hushed off stage, is the most aggressive and deeply uncivil stand ever taken by an NEH chairman. It quashes the very debates that animate the humanities.
Well, the conservatives, and we have conservatives in the humanities, and that's very good, differ with where I stand. And I think that's terrific. I think that this criticism is something people ought to think through. On the other hand, I would respond very directly. I believe that the civility issue is one of the greatest issues of our time. Our statute talks about directly that the National Endowment for the Humanities is to address issues of the time. It's to address issues of jurisprudence, among other things. It's to address issues that matter to how we bring perspective to issues of the day. And civility is part and parcel of that. Civility is something our founding fathers and mothers thought a great deal about. Our original founders were very concerned with moral philosophy, the nature of man, the need to have institutions of society that balanced views. And that is precisely what I'm addressing. As far as pride and respect in American culture and civilization, I'm going to take a backseat to no one, and I don't accept that criticism one iota.
How can studying the humanities help people temper their conversations and change the tone of debate, in your view?
Well, what the humanities are all about, and it's history, literature, philosophy, and all the related disciplines, from comparative religion to anthropology to sociology, to sometimes economics, is all about bringing perspective to issues of the day. And we learn perspective in many different ways. One is historical. Another is storytelling. I mean, that's what literature is all about. Literature is putting yourself in the shoes of someone else. You read a novel, and let's say there's a heroine. You might identify with this heroine, and then you might see a mistake the heroine makes, and you might say to yourself, well, that's a mistake that maybe I won't make because I saw how she made it. You look at history, you see mistakes that the Greeks made. You see mistakes that we've made some mistakes in our history. I mean, we have to understand that. On the whole, we're the city on a hill that has established more phenomenal institutions than any other society ever. But we make mistakes too. And so how do you meld these together? If we think of war and peace, I mean, for example, if we want to involve ourselves in the Middle East militarily, is it not relevant to look at the French experience in Algeria, the British experience, the Russian experience in Afghanistan? Are there things that we can learn from this? And I just think that not to study the humanities can lead to some of the greatest mistakes ever. And I want to come back to your introductory note, because you mentioned, and it's so true, that some people are looking at college as directly job-related disciplines, and yet nothing's more important than to stimulate the imagination when you're dealing with unprecedented circumstances. If you think about dealing with a world, and a world of greater competition, isn't it important to know something about China, know something about India, know something about why the Soviet Union failed, to have a perspective of what works and what doesn't work, and how to compete? It doesn't help to turn a blank eye.
What do you say, though, to the parent who's worried about their child getting a job, or perhaps worried about them coming back and living with them in their own home, who says, oh, goodness, they're studying anthropology. What possible use can that be to them getting a job after school? I'm worried about that. They should be studying accounting or engineering or the law.
Well, that conversation goes on in every American household. I can tell you a survey recently of top executives of American corporations has been that they want people that have studied history and literature, and that they want people with a sense of perspective. They want people that know something about foreign affairs, something about foreign cultures. I think it's a myth to think that jobs are only about being able to add and subtract and multiply and divide. Jobs are about thinking. And what is it that makes people think? Anything that makes people think and create. We sometimes forget that maybe as intensely a creative subject is the arts. And managing and understanding the arts can have something to do with whether or not one can be a good businessman.
It's interesting. I did moderate a discussion recently which was about technology, and somebody asked the business owner, how do you select an employee? And he says, I first ask them, what are they reading? Mm-hmm. He said, it's good that they know computers and everything, which is my business, but I want to know what they know about the outside world, because I want to know if they can think critically and solve problems within my, my company, with me and for me. You mentioned foreign relations several times, and obviously you have a background in that, and the committee you sat on. And one of your other priorities as NEH chairman has been a program called Bridging Cultures. And you've said that it's not even really a choice as to whether the NEH should include foreign dimensions in public engagement, but it's mandatory that we're all interdependent now. That too has been a little bit criticized, this idea of this Bridging Cultures program, which is going to bring more kind of study of foreign countries into the NEH grants.
Well, it's intended to be a study of our own country as well as foreign countries. America is a magnificent national culture, but we're also a mosaic of subcultures, and you can divide this in many different ways, one of which is by states. Idaho has a little different culture than Iowa. We grow corn, you grow potatoes.
But mess up our names all the time, Idaho and Iowa.
We in Iowa recognize flat is beautiful. You Idahoans have a different perspective. But and there are different ethnic backgrounds, different historical backgrounds. We're all a little different. And then every country is kind of a national culture which has subcultures within it. And if we don't understand them, we're likely not to deal with them well. I mean, a classic example is the Middle East issue. If you take Iraq, we entered a war when I think the majority of Congress had no idea of a distinction between Sunni and Shia. Now everybody in America knows there's a distinction. We don't all understand all of the chemistry and the subtleties, but we know the distinction. And these are things that are important to know in advance, not after one commits rather substantial resources. Likewise in business, I mean, it's so easy to make mistakes based upon things that one could study and avert.
So how will this manifest? I know you have a particular interest in bridging, making a bridge to Muslim cultures as chairman. Will you be giving out more grants then that have to do with bridging cultures?
Well, we will be putting a little more emphasis on some of the cultural aspects of international relations. And we steer clear, and this is the difference between the humanities and, let's say, the State Department. We don't take public stands on issues. We take stands on the need to study and the need to understand. And I think that is our role in life. Now, we'll be looking at certain issues in the Muslim world. We're also going to be looking at American history in very probing ways. And I might mention the National Endowment for the Humanities, an institution I had, is very much involved at the national level with basic research. But we have 50 state humanities councils, 6 territorial councils. Idaho, by the way, has one of the great state humanities councils. And disproportionately, they work in what are called the public humanities, bringing programs to people in the state. And they do a fabulous job. And many of these programs are studying American literature, or they might be studying Indian philosophy. I mean, they're of a whole variety of natures, and they're really terrific.
Time goes so quickly. We have about 5 minutes left. The last figure I saw was something like 8% of college degrees now are in the humanities. 8%. It's not as low as it has been in the 1980s, but still pretty low. Is that something that you would like to see increasing? One of the difficulties is people are not only not taking degrees because of the job thing we talked about before, but frankly, some of the first courses to get cut are humanities courses at the higher education level, and so some people having to wait to get into courses, and then they just don't take the major. And is there anything the NEH can do about that? Well,
courses are obviously student-selected circumstances. I believe very much in emphasizing the humanities, and I would suggest that it's as great a major as one could have, and if one wants to go on and be a professional given direction, it's better at the undergraduate level to have studied the humanities than perhaps prepared in that professional direction too soon. But beyond that, I would also suggest that it's awfully important if one looks at a professional school to have a humanities aspect to it. So if one wants to major in business administration, one should have a sense of what American history is. One should have a sense with what's happening in China.
Sometimes they can't get into these classes though because they've been cut so much.
Well, that is one of the downsides. Yeah. Some of the universities are saying we only want to have courses that have grants related to them, and often science leads the humanities. We don't support at the federal level the humanities to near the degree that we do the sciences.
So does that create a kind of schism between the humanities and science?
There's a financial gap that's widening, but everybody in the humanities supports all the efforts in the sciences. We would just like to see more support for the humanities as well.
And that's one of the reasons you founded the Humanities Caucus within the Congress.
Exactly, as priorities. But I mean, if you're sitting on the moon and looking down, you might wonder how the world's getting along, which is the humanities, and might think there's a greater need. You also might want to be very respectful of some of the great advances in science, and so the two have to be combined together.
As we wrap up, talk a little bit about humanities and humanism. I mean, as a reporter, I hear lots of people who shout about something called secular humanism, and they feel that, with contempt, and they feel it's actually taking moral values out of the classroom and disregarding religion and God.
Well, the humanities actually include religion as a subject matter, comparative religion in particular.
But this idea of humanism and
but the humanities are disciplines of history, literature, philosophy, etc. What is called secular humanism is considered a theory of moral action that is unrelated to religion. And for some people that's quite credible. For certain people in religion that's quite a challenge. But the humanities are not intended in any way to challenge religion. In fact, the theory is to bolster our understanding of religion and of moral values.
So to be a humanist doesn't necessarily mean you're against God
absolutely.
or religion.
And the ultimate humanist, and I want to leave with one quote, which I think is wonderful, and it comes from Jefferson. Jefferson argued that, and he argued this in the context that he was a student of comparative religions, of all the great religions in the world. And he said what really mattered was where the great religions conjoined, not where they differentiated. And that would be a humanistic conclusion about moral values. And I think it's very profound and something we ought to think about.
You've been on this job for about a year. You already had quite a steeping in humanities. What, if anything, has surprised you in the past year? We have about a minute left, but what?
I am surprised at how intense our polarization is becoming. I'm also impressed with how large numbers of people don't identify with it. That is, there is a sense in America that somehow the best and the brightest have to a degree let the country down, and they want to see more prudential management of resources. They also don't want to see government implode. And how you balance that is going to be one of the challenges the next decade or two in American public life.
Well, indeed, we had a viewer write in on our Facebook page to say, I hope that he can achieve his vision for a political center which is able to accomplish societal goals that are favored by most folks. So it sounds like you're agreeing with him that most people are
well, I appreciate that, but I think we all have to recognize sometimes the far right is closer to the truth than the center. Sometimes the left might be a little closer to the truth on some issues, and so it isn't always that the center is right. I mean, you have to judgmentally balance it, and then there are eras where you want to move a little bit to the right, and other eras, maybe, let's say the 1930s, that there was a case for a little more government intervention. Under Ronald Reagan in the 80s, a case for a little less government. So you have eras, you have philosophies, and then you have to have respect for process, how you respect all citizens.
Well, thank you very much. You're halfway through your 50-state tour. I appreciate your visiting with us. You've been listening to Jim Leach. He is the chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities. I'm Marcia Franklin. Thanks for tuning in to this edition of Dialogue.
Presentation of Dialogue on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore family's legacy of building the great state of Idaho.